We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by a producer for Sinclair and a senior contributor at The Federalist, and that would be Ellie Bufkin. Ellie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Ellie is a film buff, which is why she's here, because an anniversary occurred technically this week on Sunday that we could not let go unnoticed. And that would be the 30th anniversary of Silence of the Lambs. Silence with the Lambs is a very different movie, I imagine, although it could also be interesting. Silence of the Lambs. 30th anniversary was on Valentine's Day. Actually, it was released on Valentine's Day appropriately in 1991. Now, we want to talk about the film, of course, but we also want to talk about what the film means and how the sort of Hollywood, the evolution of Hollywood in the last 30 years, how it was very much a product of its era. And so we want to sort of broaden the conversation as well, but we will dwell, of course, on this beautiful, beautiful piece of art. I don't know about you, Ellie. I think this is one of, simply the greatest films ever made. And I actually think it's the scariest movie I've ever seen. What do you think?
I agree. And I think it was really, for me, the time that it came out, I was 7. And I think I saw it like pretty early. I don't think I saw it like in the theater, but maybe just a couple of years after that. And it was really kind of my introduction to, what the psychological thriller, almost, horror genre could be. And this movie really kind of plays in both camps, which I think is really exciting. But unlike some kind of like, shock for the sake of shock, psycho movies, this one really doesn't do that. It's art, as you mentioned, and I think it really weaves together this great way to introduce film people to just how good that genre can be. So there's a reason it's iconic, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, I want to unpack just sort of like on a technical level some of the reasons that you think that, like, what stands out to you on a technical level about this movie. There's a lot of other stuff to unpack, as you just mentioned, because we have to talk about, the sort of contemporary reaction to what is considered, at least by the AV Club, and I've seen some others, to be the trans exploitation in the depiction of Buffalo Bill. And there's other things as it relates to, like, James Gumb, one of the characters. By the way, if you have not seen this movie, you will probably encounter spoilers in this episode. That should go without saying. But Ellie, just on the sort of technical aspects, what stands out to you about Silence of the Lambs?
I think, kind of tying into what I kind of mentioned, one of the technical aspects to me is that it kind of has this almost quiet narrative where we meet Clarice and we kind of follow the story through her eyes as an investigator, and how she's, coming in close contact with someone who's this, psychopath who's going to sort of help her in her investigation. But we never actually get to this point where obviously there's tense scenes in the movie that are more fear-inducing than others, but it's really woven into this really beautiful, whodunit kind of story. And how are we going to get to the person, before the end? Is this going to be resolved happily? And that's kind of how you follow it. And the way that it's put together, I think technically, is really just a beautiful way of storytelling. It's a great way that you would be able to tell any story, not just, a film in this genre. It's fun to watch. It's captivating. You can watch it multiple times throughout the years, as I certainly have, and always find something new to get excited about and be able to follow the plot, and just kind of always have a really good time and still be scared, no matter, whether exactly what's going to happen, how things turn out for each character. It's always, a good time. And I love that it's put together in that really just thoughtful way. It flows really beautifully from the opening sequence of the movie all the way until the end credits.
I like what you're talking about there, and there's this sort of build to the movie where it's almost like, and this is a weird word to use with a horror film or even a thriller or suspense film, but there's a subtlety to the script and to the writing that's like, it's, you used the word quiet. I think that's so true. And again, this is a horror movie or a suspense movie, unlike so many others, although we've seen people try, but it does have this quiet power. And I think some of that comes from, actually, I just learned this, but some of that absolutely comes from Anthony Hopkins' performance. But Hopkins, I didn't know this, is only on screen for 16 minutes. He's in this film for 16 minutes. And it's that sort of quiet power of Hannibal Lecter that it's able to just sort of be in your head even when he's not on screen, which is what makes this movie so terrifying and in a real life aspect, because it mirrors the real life aspect of like, that's what's so terrifying about serial killers.
Absolutely. And I think that particularly the Hannibal Lecter character, he's built up so well, not just from this movie, but if you saw the William Peterson movie, Manhunter, before this, you kind of get that idea that he's bigger than life serial killer. Yes, he is a cannibal and he ate all these people and he killed them and it was horrible. But more than that, it's the legend of Hannibal Lecter, because certainly he's not a scary character in the movie. Most of the time he's behind, this incredible level of security. He's not going to get to anybody, but even conversations with him, with a leather mask wrapped around his face and a straitjacket behind bars, you're still like, this guy can take us all out and he's smarter than all of us and he's a raving psychopath. And then just underneath this genteel Englishman exterior, that he just kind of brings you into his scary web, and everybody kind of falls for it. It's such a moniker now because it's used so often in film and in TV shows, and particularly it's just, the guy that you can trust. You kind of see it, I think Prodigal Son, I don't watch it, but I know it's a popular show and that's kind of the premise. It's this sort of refined dad who turned out to be a psychopathic serial killer. And that idea of this character that's not overtly terrifying, like Jason Voorhees or Freddy, is actually just as scary because of what he's not doing and because of what he doesn't appear to be capable of. So I think it's interesting. I actually didn't know that his screen time was so short. As you mentioned it, I was kind of sitting here like, that can't be. But because almost none of us think of Silence of the Lambs as being anything but an Anthony Hopkins movie. So for the lead character to have that little amount of time on screen is really speaks to, one, how the story is written and how scary that character is, even just being talked about, not even being on camera. Really, the movie's actually more about Clarice and the investigation overall, but, you kind of have to go back and watch it to remind yourself of that. So I think, I agree. I think that's really interesting. And his level of scary is very unique, and it's great for storytelling.
Well, yeah, and like this is not an easy role to play. Like it's an easy role to play on one note and, to be sort of like scary and villainous. But what he does with it, I mean, it does harken back, I think, a little bit to Psycho, and, what Hitchcock was able to do with his killer. And I think it does harken back to that. And I think it's sort of, it's inspired by that in some ways, but that sort of like power that Hopkins is able to channel so quietly and subtly, it's really amazing. And I actually think, this is, I'm sort of one of those people that like has a hard time getting through horror movies and actually being scared. Like usually I just laugh. Like I can't watch horror movies without like laughing at them. But with this one, the last, I would say like 10 minutes, and particularly the last scene with the night vision goggles, I think is easily the most scared I've ever been in any film. I think it's the scariest like 2 minutes of cinema in the history of Hollywood.
I think that's great. And I think that it's almost sad how these things get copied over time and riffed on in other movies and other shows. And so it almost kind of takes away from that impact. When you see it years later, you're like, wow, this is really iconic and it was really scary, and now we know that people are copying over and you see it in other places. And it has kind of less, of a terrifying impact than maybe it did the first time. But I think it still really says something, that it's still scary, even though it's something that we're expecting and that we've seen again and again. And I think one of the things is in this genre, and again, it's kind of got two genres tied to it because it's a horror movie, I think for sure. But it's also, a psychological thriller, and it has a lot of plot. And I think that really makes it stand out on its own in terms of the horror genre, because you find very infrequently movies that are meant to last more than, a summer or Halloween season, and are considered good movies. I think, Get Out was a recent exception. Quiet Place was a recent exception where those movies actually came out with stories that were interesting, that you followed, that you like them, and whether you like them or not, but they were kind of more into that genre where there are monsters and it is scary, but at the same time, you get invested in the characters. You want to know what happens and how things turn out. I think it's really hard to do. I think, and one of the things I like, obviously this movie is based on, a novel or multiple novels, but the story itself, the way that it translated onto screen was almost pitch perfect. It's difficult to put a story with as much detail as these novels had on camera and to be able to make it that as interesting and as terrifying as a reader would have been going through that story. And they did such an incredible job.
And as complicated. I think that's probably the most difficult thing in taking something from page to screen is like actually keeping the complexity of the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you have to do it in every scene. And I think that going back to what we were talking about, Anthony Hopkins having such little screen time, he's mentioned often and he's referenced often. And you can tell just the way the characters are written, even when he's not there, you can tell they're thinking about him. Obviously, the way that that's kind of worked in the story early, they can't bring him in to consult him on this investigation. And that they're constantly afraid of him and constantly thinking about him. So then you, as the viewer, are thinking those same things. Like, when's he going to come back? Is he going to eat somebody in this movie? Like, I don't know if I want to see that. So it keeps you on edge while you're going through this actually compelling, mystery through the whole thing, which is, it's just fun.
Well, speaking of eating people, one thing that Silence of the Lambs sort of with 30 years in the rearview mirror, we can now say, like, it really does hold up. And in a way that, like, the best example, I think, is The Exorcist. The Exorcist does not hold up, in my opinion. I mean, I wasn't alive when it came out, but I just don't think that the fear factor actually still exists. But I think because Silence of the Lambs was so consciously a psychological thriller and so successfully a psychological thriller through the script and through the acting, it really does still manage to pack such a punch. And I'm curious what you think. There are some scenes, I mean, nothing like the elevator scene, like after I watched the film the first time, still like I was suddenly like very conscious of what might be on top of the elevator. But so that's like, there are some moments in the film where there's, I guess you could call it gore. Mm-hmm. And that's always like a really tricky thing in horror films to get right. So I'm curious what you thought of Silence of the Lambs or treatment of the physical element of gore and maybe how that is compared to what we see on screen before Silence of the Lambs and today.
Yeah, I think much like a lot of the elements of the movie, they exercised real restraint with gore. Doesn't mean that they edited all of it out, that they made it a PG movie. It was still very much rated R, but again, they didn't overindulge. So even though we knew what these psychos were doing, what they were capable of, we didn't really see it in that gritty detail, unless it really, really mattered for the story. We knew what was going on with the skin lamp and, the fattening people up to skin them. And, that they did a good enough job kind of alluding to a lot of that you really didn't have to see, a fake human being cut up and skinned alive, because you understood that was already happening. And it was enough to really creep you out and get you hooked into it without making you, do that look away thing, halfway through the movie. And I think to your point about The Exorcist is they indulged in everything. They showed, there was no illusion, right? There
Green vomit.
Oh, exactly. And we all laugh about it now, and it's obviously extremely dated. I think that story is still good. I think parts of that movie really hold up well, but you're absolutely right. And I think the difference is, and that came out, forgive me, I'm going to blank on the year, but I think it was the early 70s. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about, maybe 15 to 20 years before this movie that we're talking about today. And I think that Hollywood was really learning at that time, because they were coming into a phase where there was a lot more Hollywood magic that was available and still probably looked pretty good. They were right before computer generated graphics really became mainstream. And I think that the choice is either go full gore, just dump buckets of blood into the film set, green vomit everywhere, fake body skinning, whatever, or we wrap that into more of the script and more of the character reactions and see how that kind of develops. Now, it's a risk, because I think when you're getting people into a theater to see a horror movie, they kind of expect a little bit of blood and gore all over the set. So when you're not doing it, you have to tell a really good, sharp, compact story and really grab the viewers in. And I think that they struck the perfect balance between the two.
Well, and the Academy agreed. This is the first horror movie, not the first to be nominated, but the first to win Best Picture. And so that, I think, really says a lot. That's an uphill battle for any film of the genre to snag that award. And it's hard to, I guess Parasite is sort of similar in that it has sort of like the suspense / horror elements. Can you think of anything else? I'm trying to think off the top of my head what might be in the same vein from recent years.
I mentioned Get Out. Obviously, there's like a supernatural element to that movie. Maybe not, but there was some very evil people, depending on how you look at it. But there was also, the overarching, plot of racism and just classism and, cultural ID and that kind of thing. So I think that one kind of played both camps and actually probably a couple other camps if you're really listing genres. I guess maybe The Shape of Water attempted that.
I did not see that movie.
I don't recommend it. But there was a fish man, but there was also a love story, and it was the Cold War, and that's really all you need to know.
Good summary.
Yeah, the most horrifying theme wasn't supposed to be scary, I'm pretty sure, but people who see the movie know exactly what I'm talking about. But in recent times, I think I don't know. I guess I'm kind of blanking.
No, Get Out is a really strong. I think that's a really strong example. And that sort of like brings me to one question I wanted to ask you about Silence of the Lambs. There are, I guess, layers. By today's standard, we already see that like there's an AV Club review that folks can read if they want to. I think it's like something to the effect of like James Gumb deserved better. And so it's already like through today's lens being analyzed on a sort of, I guess, sexual level, and by sexual I mean biological sexual level, and the sort of gender LGBT lens as well, and that Buffalo Bill is an exploitive trans stereotype, I suppose, is the argument that goes along that the left is sort of promulgating on that point. But I wonder what you think of the sort of gender dynamics and the treatment of Buffalo Bill with the sort of benefit of 30 years hindsight. Do you think that there's anything that from today's perspective is uncomfortable to watch, or do you think it's it sort of has a good mix of the dynamics?
Only uncomfortable in that it's one of those movies now through the lens of 2020, 2021, you look back and you watch a movie like this and you cringe because you can only imagine how people are reacting in places like AV and blogs full of woke people who never even watched the movie before they realized there was something to complain about. But actually watching it from just a perspective of somebody who enjoys movies and understands culture, there's nothing uncomfortable about it. And in fact, if you're going to talk about the fact that it's uncomfortable for trans people, they go out of their way to say, like, he's not a real transsexual. That's an actual line in the movie. So for people to kind of gloss over that and be like, well, so what is offensive? The fact that they're portraying a transsexual in their mind and he's the bad guy? Because it's kind of unfair if you want to be a trans person and you want to be part of culture, but you never want to be the bad guy. He's not a bad guy because he's trans. that was not the point of that at all. And also they explicitly said that he was not. And so, no, obviously I don't find it offensive at all. Obviously I'm biased. But at the same time, it's just kind of a ridiculous complaint. That AV article, again, if you take the time to read it, which that's on you, but it's just a ridiculous blast searching for something to get, cranked up about in a movie that literally is 30 years old and nobody's had any issue with before today. So it's, again, shifting that Overton window and having all of our, thoughts and feelings and emotions about whatever issue you want and casting it on anything that you can find, no matter when it was made, who made it, or what it was about. Would they make this movie today with the same exact plot, the same exact characters, and the same exact considerations? No, probably not. And that's too bad, because I think it adds a lot to the depth of that character and that story. One of the complaints that author of that AV article had was that, I guess that our author is trans, and said that they grew up with that joke about tucking, there's that famous scene. And that was really, hurtful and offensive to the writer. And it's like, okay. If you're getting offended by scenes from 30-year-old movies and people, making jokes about those 30-year-old movies, then, it's probably a psychological problem that you need to have, discussed and talked about, more than criticizing Hollywood for adapting a novel and making it into a movie with this element being, part of the character. If we start striking down every bad guy that has a trait that's similar to or reminds you of something that's hurtful to you, our bad guy's going to be left with nothing but fake superheroes. We're going to have a bunch of like Thanoses running around because you can't have any relation to a human being whatsoever because someone's going to get offended.
Well, they all have to be white men, right? Like white cisgender men. That's the point.
As long as they're white, straight, cisgender males, then obviously those are the bad guys from here on out. They can exactly. They're obviously real white men are capable of all kinds of crimes. So.
Yeah, well, like Hannibal Lecter. And you raised a point that I want to sort of hover over, which is that there's a quote in one of the retrospectives on Silence of the Lambs. I forget. I think it may have been in CNBC, actually. I don't think it was the AV Club article, but they quoted somebody. I think it was a Hollywood executive. Again, I'm not totally sure, but they quoted somebody in the industry saying that this movie, were it to be made today, would require significant rewrites to address the sort of alleged or perceived political incorrectness of the Buffalo Bill character. And I just think that's like a really sad statement on how our standards right now are, eroding the quality of our art. I mean, this is as close to a perfect movie as I can think of, with the exception of like Rear Window or something maybe. But like this falls into the rare sort of echelon of near perfect, if not entirely perfect movies. And so the thought makes me so sad that producers and scriptwriters would be sitting around a boardroom in 2021 reading this script and saying, you need to actually dilute or change the way that Buffalo Bill is dealt with. And what that does is it always ends up putting it through some like weird corporatized sex and gender filter that bears just so much like less resemblance of the actual point and of the actual art. It always gets this like, it just gets sort of gummed up and sort of foggy, and there's just like no resemblance to the actual art. And again, like it's not the sort of factual basis for Buffalo Bill. Whether or not you agree with the depiction of him and the film's treatment of him, there's often this sort of element of sex and gender at the heart of so many of these like real life case studies. It's sad and it's tragic, and it's something as a society we need to learn to deal with and to deal with better. And I hope that we have in the last 30 years. But I mean, there's just like, this is a real issue. And so to filter it through the now the sort of like overly corporate Hollywood human resources lens, I mean, that's just a sad thought.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that you lose the message. I mean, forget any kind of moral message, but you just lose the point of your story, your work, your art, when you start having to force it through this, cultural filter where you have to get the approval of the most radical voice. So the very smallest sector, and whatever reason, the loudest that's on social media or writing articles for AV, those are getting, as soon as there's any complaint and it's published and it's known and it gets a hashtag or it gets retweeted, then Hollywood responds as though, that's the only choice they have, as if they're not the ones that are in control of what's happening. And I think that it's a real shame. And I think even people were like, oh, what are you complaining about Gone with the Wind? All they did was put a warning on the front of it. I think even that is too far. I think that the idea that we can't trust viewers to make their own decisions about what is moral and what is good is a real shame. And I think that as soon as you start, putting whatever, moral high ground you think you are in front of every single piece of art that has been made, is being made, or will be made in the future, you really lose the ability to make anything of quality. And you suck the soul out of things that have already been made. I think that even having the conversation about, hey, this is an anti-trans movie is somewhat harmful to the film's reputation. It's not true, first of all, but people are listening because as soon as you say anti-trans, now everybody's listening. And everyone's like, what are people upset about? And it gets amplified, from both people that are supportive of that movement and people that are against it. Because, and I'm certainly, guilty of this, whenever I see anything that's ridiculous, the first thing I do is shout about how ridiculous it is. And I write about it. And then, of course, people are like, well, what is this about? I didn't even know this was a thing that's happening. And then all of a sudden, it's all that anybody on either side is talking about. And Hollywood then has to react. It's like, well, the Republicans hate it and the Democrats like it. So clearly we know what to do here. And that's when we start losing things. I mean, I still can't believe that we've got, TV shows that went off the air 4 or 5 years ago that had to delete 3 or 4 episodes, including 30 Rock and Community and even a couple of episodes of The Office, just gone. You can't get them anymore. You can't watch them on any streaming service. So, it's just one of those things. Well, what's next? And how, are those goalposts going to keep moving and what else is going to get erased from us? Doesn't seem like a big deal now, but this is art. And I think that it captures, one, what the director, what the writers, and what the actors had in mind at the time. And I think that's really important. But also, two, movies and TV particularly capture the cultural moment of when they're being made. And I think that's really important. So when you try to force everything from 1991 into the box for 2021, it's not going to be the same thing. And you're going to see it differently. But that's actually a great human exercise. It's great to look back on older movies. Think back 30 years ago. How were we thinking? How was this received? Wow, that's fascinating. And that helps me see things in a cultural perspective and in a healthy perspective. So yeah, I mean, mostly I just think it's a crying shame to have to sit through this every time, somebody decides to get mad about something and worry about what's next, what's going to be the next target.
Yeah. Another great point is that, so Gone with the Wind is actually a really good window into how Southerners felt during Reconstruction. And you can disagree, of course, I'm assuming both of us do, about a lot of those opinions and a lot of language, et cetera, but it's a helpful glimpse into that window. You don't have to venerate the perspective to appreciate the art itself. And so, yeah, and by the way, there is a place where you can watch those episodes of The Office and 30 Rock and Community, and it's my apartment on my DVD player, because I think you're completely right about, like, there's no limiting principle here. So who knows what else is going to get erased? And I mean, at this point, they could literally not make The Office today. And Steve Carell has straight up come out and said that. And it's like one of the greatest shows of all time, but that's exactly how chilling this atmosphere has been in Hollywood and to our culture, is that, like, literally you can't satirize racism by showing ignorant racists. You can't do it. Like, you cannot, satire is dead. But one thing that's not dead, and that's actually thriving right now as Silence of the Lambs hits its 30th birthday, is true crime. True crime is absolutely thriving. I think it's particularly thriving with women. And we saw CBS is out with a new series called Clarice. And that is a sort of chronicling, or a prequel, I believe, to how Clarice Starling, eventually landed on the case that we see Silence of the Lambs follow. And there's also Hannibal, and there were multiple Silence of the Lambs basically movies made, and actually I think the second one in particular is excellent. But this movie it continues to have a really visible fingerprint on our cultural space. And I'm curious what you think, about what you think the sort of enduring legacy of Silence of the Lambs is.
I think that a lot of the stuff we talked about earlier, just the fact that it's it's such a well-made movie, and it's scary, but it's also exciting, and it's captivating. You've got great performances, obviously, Anthony Hopkins and his 16 minutes, Jodie Foster, and this is a huge role for her, really break out after being kind of known as the 14-year-old prostitute and Taxi driver. And I think that this movie really hit at that perfect time in 1991, where we were looking for good movies then. I was a little young now to kind of understand that movement, or young then, but going back and looking at movies, that came out around the early 90s, they were looking to, set the mold for genres for that decade. You see in 93, 94, those were those huge years where you had, Jurassic Park and Schindler's List and Shawshank Redemption and all these really important genre defining films that came out. And I think just a couple of years before that, you see this was that movie that really set the pace for, psychological movies, for horror movies. I still remember it as, that picture with the, face and the butterfly sitting on the shelf at Blockbuster Video and just being like almost too scared to pick it up because it's like, ooh, Silence of the Lambs. It became just completely attached to the title of the movie. And, nobody knows it until you see the movie and know what it comes from. But the title became synonymous with like, oh, that's scary. And I think that that's really its legacy. But I think that the period in which it was made is also a huge part of its legacy. I think that that's an important moment. It really set the tone for not just the decade that it was made, but also the decades that came after. And we look at that like we talked about a couple movies, earlier in the podcast, Get Out and maybe A Quiet Place and some other ones like that clearly kind of took a cue from how that movie was able to define that moment in time with the story that they were telling. Without really, having any kind of nostalgia to it at all. There's no scene in that movie that I can think of that's like, oh, that's so 90s. Like it
Yes.
really could happen at like any time. Obviously they don't have cell phones, but other than that, it really is really defining of a film moment in time, in recent time, and kind of that bridge from a movie that seemed older into a movie that is clearly modern and tells a story for, multiple generations ahead of it.
That's so interesting. And I actually love your point about the cover art, which is something that, is less appreciated now because you don't have a physical copy to sort of pick out at Blockbuster and you're not sort of like sorting or sifting through walls of VHSs or DVDs and using the cover to help you pick out what you want to watch. But it gets to sort of the silence aspect of Silence of the Lambs, which is how we started this conversation, in that there was something so powerful, even about this sort of the story, I don't know, maybe allegory is the right category for it, but the story about the Silence of the Lambs itself that Hannibal sort of exploits from Clarice's past in this incredibly haunting and deep and powerful and just cerebral way that you don't often find in horror movies. And it just is such a quiet power to that. And it makes me think of why I've been thinking a lot lately about why true crime is thriving. It started before the pandemic and then accelerated over the course of the pandemic. It does seem like a lot of women in particular have long been and are now more than ever really grabbed by this genre and like really fixated on it and interested in it. And I think I'm thinking about the scene in Silence of the Lambs right now where Buffalo Bill abducts his victim into the van, and the directing in that scene is very much like this is an apartment building parking lot. And this is a room, like Buffalo Bill's room is an apartment room, or what I assume it's an apartment room in an apartment building. And it's in sort of suburban or rural America. And it blends in. It's this like horror that you would never be able to see from the surface level of that building. And, if you're trying to help a man in a parking lot, right? Like this is sort of the thing that is engaging about horror often and about horror in this sort of serial killer drama. But Silence of the Lambs does it so well. And I think in the sort of like industrialized world that we live in right now, particularly for the middle class, there is something so frightening, and Silence of the Lambs is maybe the most important contribution, besides like Psycho, to this genre of that everyday disruption of evil that serial killers represent. This notion that you can be living tranquil, middle class, comfortable lives, and evil still lurks beneath everyday surfaces. I feel like because of the way that we live, because of the comforts of modern life, that's what's sort of particularly compelling. And I think like one reason I don't like watch these movies because I'm consciously afraid, or enjoy this genre because I'm consciously afraid and thinking I'm about to be abducted. It's more because that sort of contrast, or the juxtaposition between the sort of comforts of modern life and the sort of civility that we seem to feel we live in the modern world, the way that contrasts with the endurance of evil and of just such crudeness. Is that maybe what's compelling about this?
Perhaps. I think it's interesting to bring up the true crime element, and I think there's definitely a reason that it's women who are mostly excited about it. I am personally, I've always been into true crime. Obviously, everyone else being into it now is great for me because there's a lot more content. But when I was young, we watched like The New Detectives, which was a great show about forensic science, and it really focused on the search, the hunt, the investigation, and very little of, families talking about, oh, she was such a nice person. Not to say I don't care. I'm sure they were a nice person, but I don't care. I don't know how you show me the blood vial shaking on the thing and tell me how you found DNA on the glove. I think that there's a sense of power that women have over finding and punishing perpetrators of violence, particularly of sexual violence, because there is definitely a difference in genders always, but in particular when it comes to scary men with weapons overpowering you and being able to do whatever they want, including, up to killing you. That's a very scary thing. And it's a very real thing that happens in this country. And we all know about these legendary serial killers, Ted Bundy and Green River Killer, and, all of these very famous, almost iconic men. And I think, in absorbing all of this true crime, in a way, we're getting the sense that we're part of the investigation that brought them down. Mm-hmm. And I think, Michelle McNamara wrote that really great book about the Golden State Killer. And I read the book. I think it's great. And you can kind of see that in the way that she writes. She is an elegant writer and really told a great story. And I think that especially in that story, because it took them so long to find him, and he was just such a brutal killer and rapist and an awful person. And that moment where we all saw on TV after Michelle McNamara sadly passed away that he was being caught, I think we all kind of felt like we were sort of part of her crew, like we did it all together. And so I think that there's a real reason that there's one sex that's particularly interested in that genre. I'm not sure that I actually came to that realization before this conversation right now, but as you were talking and making such good points, I really, it just kind of dawned on me. There has to be a reason. Obviously, I love mysteries. Mysteries are easy to love. There's always something to follow. There's a great resolution. But I think that these true crime, books and documentaries and podcasts that have been so huge, I think that being part of tracking down a terrible man is really something that gives women a sense of accomplishment and a sense of power in an otherwise situation where they could feel like a victim or feel powerless. And one of the things about Silence of the Lambs that I was just thinking about too, in terms of, feminism, I would never think of this movie as a feminist movie, but look at the female characters in this movie. I forget the actress's name, but when she's in when she's being held captive by Buffalo Bill, she's funny and she's still scary. She's mean and snarky, and you kind of appreciate that. She never sort of plays she's trapped. She can't go anywhere. She's probably going to die. And at the same time, you kind of like appreciate that she's kind of conniving and she tries to play tricks and get out. And Jodie Foster, they never hone in on the fact that she's beautiful but misunderstood. She's Jodie Foster. She's tough. She's scrappy. She played that character so well. You totally believed from the moment that she was on camera that she was an FBI investigator. There was no problem with that. Like, I never thought of her as like, a pretty actress with an FBI jacket on. Like, and that's so hard to do. But for them to just immediately choose that kind of person to play that role, I think is really, really important. But it really kind of goes, it really makes a good statement of strength in women to take on these powerful captors and to these extremely terrifying men, and to be able to sit with them and to interact with them in a way that is not scary, I think kind of speaks to that same thing that I was thinking about with true crime. It really is a satisfying moment of female power.
No, actually, that's such a good point, because this is something that today's sort of entertainment industry can absolutely learn from Silence of the Lambs, which is that you don't need to shove sex dynamics down everybody's throats to make it powerful. It's much more powerful if you don't. And so, like, yeah, I think, there are a lot of, probably Jodie Foster would consider this movie a feminist project because of the sexual dynamics at play. And they do sort of, the way she's treated by other agents is very much like at issue in the film. And but I actually think of it as like truer to what really happens, because it is more it's just more realistic, and it's not sort of like, it's the sort of theme of the sex dynamics is not the foremost lens through which the story is told. It's there, and it motivates the character, I think, in believable ways, and it motivates the action in believable ways, but it's not the driving force, which I do think makes that ending sort of all the more powerful. Your point about Michelle McNamara is really interesting as well, because she, wrote about the sort of sexual trauma that she suffered in her own life. And I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which is the HBO docuseries that tracks her life as she wrote the book about the Golden State Killer, is really fascinating and well done. If maybe a little, it could have used some trimming, but it sort of talks about how that was a motivating factor for her. The first time I started really thinking about why women in particular are flocking to the true crime drama, I was at a panel, I kid you not, or a conversation between Amanda Knox and Lorena Bobbitt, hosted. It was part of like a true crime festival hosted at GW, which is where I went to school, but this was just a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And I looked around the auditorium. It was all women. And to me, that was just like such an interesting thing. And I wonder, with shows like Clarice and with shows like Hannibal, I mean, or even like CSI, which has been around forever. But I do wonder if there's that element that you were talking about. Like there's the satisfaction of bad men being, it's obviously, I'm sure it's a lot of things, and I don't want to oversimplify, but I think that element is convincing. And I guess maybe we can wrap by just your thoughts on how Jodie Foster played Clarice, and how that interacted with how she as an actress interacted with the gender dynamics, how the screenwriters interacted with the gender dynamics, and then, without being obsessed with the sort of identity layer of the film, exactly what's the sort of like big takeaway or the legacy of Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling.
Yeah, I think that Jodie Foster really has a great Hollywood career to look back on and reflect on if you're going to make strong female casting choices going forward. Because, as I mentioned, Jodie Foster's personal identity never had anything to do with anything until a few years ago, when she came out as a gay woman. And nobody
kind of the weirdest coming out ever. Remember that?
I don't know this character. I said whatever happened. I remember people were talking about it, but for a long time they didn't. And she's played these types of roles for a while. I think never better than when she played Clarice. But as I kind of said before, and I think that you just characterized it really well, I don't think that Clarice Starling was something that people are like, this has to be a strong female woman. Like, I think that when that casting note probably came out, they were just looking for someone who could read the lines really well. Jodie Foster is just so great at effortlessly embodying somebody who is simultaneously, she is beautiful and captivating on camera, but she's not a movie star-let look. I mean, she doesn't have voluptuous features. She isn't, the type of person that would play a pinup girl. But she is also a beautiful woman, but she plays these very strong, very emotionally aware characters. And I think that one of the most important things about her casting in this movie is Clarice's past was really important to her character in this film. And it obviously comes up later. It has a lot to do with the title of the movie. And I think that she needed to be somebody who was just obviously a complex person, who had a unique past, who had struggles. And that's one of the things that probably made her driven to be this. And again, I think that this role for her, it was very obvious that she understood that dynamic of the character when she played the part. Obviously her pain was something that came back and, was effective in, being able to do her job really well. But there was never a moment, and I said this earlier, there was never a moment in which I thought, she's a diminutive woman too. So, the idea of her being, a kind of an FBI big shot is sort of, unbelievable if you just look at it from a physical characteristic. But when you get the cerebral element and the toughness and her just, her strength, her inner strength and her personal strength, you totally understand. And in roles that she's taken, since then, obviously, like Panic Room, not a great movie, but she was, a very tough woman. And she's done a couple of those movies where she ended up having to be like very strong and, had a lot of fortitude against male characters. And she's just kind of a clear choice for that, because I think that, especially women can look at her in roles like that and relate to her, because she probably looks a little bit, at least, like someone that they know. And the way that she can kind of take that sort of normal vibe and make it into an almost superhero of strength against her oppressors is really admirable. And she's very, very good at it. I think this movie is clearly her best role. She's done some amazing films and she's very talented. So that says a lot, because I think it's, this is her best role by a country mile. I don't think that there's a competition for it. I think that it really says something about the way that she just kind of embodied that character and did such a good job.
Yeah, and another thing I want to mention on that note is that I don't know if you could find somebody to play Clarice Starling in today the way that Jodie Foster did, because she plays her with a stoicism, but she also lets the mask slip when it would be realistic for somebody to let the mask slip. She is not sort of like impenetrably stoic. She's shaken at sometimes, and almost in a feminine way, where the register of her voice, she sort of whimpers. She's not afraid to play this role in a way where like she just is this kind of like one note or maybe two note like badass. But then also like she has this feminine side, like total miscongeniality. No, like there's a complexity that's much more realistic. And I do think the sort of realistic aspect of this movie and every horror movie is obviously so key to its power. But yeah, I just like, I sort of struggle to think about, whether there are enough people who would really come to this role with that sort of honesty about how a woman would react in these situations. Like today, would we have to deal with like freaking Brie Larson?
Yeah, probably. I was just sitting here as you were talking. I'm sitting here trying to like list off people that they might try to shoehorn into that role. To be honest, I saw Clarice advertised the other day and I was curious about it and read far enough to say that they don't have the license to mention Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
And at that point it was like, I mean,
the rights are like broken up in a weird way. It's kind of funny.
I think it's interesting because, old Hollywood didn't really have the types that could have played that part either. The gender difference in Hollywood used to be a lot starker. That kind of came from like the golden age of this, pinup era. I mean, you had Katharine Hepburn who could play, roles like that for sure, but still with a much more glamorous kind of touch to it. But I don't know. Today, you mentioned Brie Larson. I can see that they might like her for that. Just off the top of my head, I don't know. I mean, if you kind of go through like the Marvel franchise, I mean, maybe somebody like Evangeline Lilly could handle something like that. But yeah, I don't think there's anybody who jumps off the page, but I also don't think that there's a modern equivalent in that age bracket that is the same as Jodie Foster. And again, it's one of those roles that was done so well that it's difficult for me to look at, an obvious choice for a remake, because why would I ever want to see a remake?
I hope they never try to remake this. Like Clarice is bad enough.
Yeah.
And I think again, the thing that disturbs me to think about is that it's the honesty she brought to the role is so important, that like, this is actually like women are vulnerable. And it's important to sort of show that and not just put on this mask of stoicism that never slips. So with that, Ellie Bufkin, producer at Sinclair, senior contributor at The Federalist. Thank you so much for stopping by to celebrate this important anniversary.
Thank you very much. And thank you for making me feel very old, because I do remember when this movie was new.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for making you feel old, but I was not even born when this movie came out.
Okay, it's all right. We've been through this before, and the years have known each other.
Exactly.
Eventually, everything's turning 30 now, so, it's fine.
That's true.
That's I'm happy to be alive.
Oh, that's funny. Well, it's funny for me now. So you've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at the Federalist. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.